welcome everybody to the Ottawa Art Gallery's Art and Tea event. And right now we're going to have a little spot talk here in the gallery where we get to look at art together on the spot, and have this sort of nice experience looking at things together. My name is Amy Wallace. I am Assistant Curator at the Ottawa Art Gallery. And this year we are celebrating Ottawa's bicentennial. We're marking that as 200 plus. So today, for this spot talk, I decided to focus on outdoor painting, specifically in the Ottawa region. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Firestone collection, it was amassed by the Firestones, Ottawa collectors, starting in the early 1950s. And they brought together over 1,600 works of art, which in 1972 they donated. And in 1992, the Ottawa Art Gallery became involved as the steward of the collection. We interpret it in exhibitions like the one you see here, and we make sure that it's taken care of, and we facilitate public access to the collection. So within the Firestone collection, works by the Group of Seven are particularly well represented, making up 40% of the entire Firestone collection. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Group of Seven, they were a group of landscape painters in Canada who formed in 1920. This was the year that they had their first exhibition at the Art Gallery of Toronto, later the Art Gallery of Ontario, and they disbanded in 1933. And they were known for advancing a national art movement, one that was really rooted in the landscape. And within the Group of Seven, in particular, A.Y. Jackson, who we see painting here, is especially well represented in the Firestone collection. We have over 250 works by A.Y. Jackson, which makes us the third largest holding of works by A.Y. Jackson in Canada. We see him here painting outdoors. It was really a central part of Jackson's practice, and we're going to be focusing on A.Y. Jackson today, as well as one of the next generation of Canadian painters, Henri Masson, who also engaged in outdoor painting in this area. The reason why Jackson is so well represented in the Firestone collection is because he became good friends with the Firestones, so much so that they would host his birthday parties, and they ended up really focusing on Jackson and not just collecting his art, but also collecting some of his tools, and in particular the tools that he would use as an outdoor landscape painter. So we'll look at those today too. Jackson was born in Montreal, and although he was a painter who was very focused on the Canadian landscape, he was absolutely bringing in international influences into his art. So among the influences that the Group of Seven turned to, they were looking at Scandinavian painting, they were looking at French post-impressionism, and I think another really important one that has been maybe a bit overlooked in art history is landscape theory and practice of the 19th century. And in particular for Jackson, when he was a very young artist, he read a book by the English art critic John Ruskin called Modern Painters. Ruskin published this in a series of volumes from 1943 to 1960. Jackson reads it around the turn of the century, and he takes away from it this idea that Ruskin puts forward of truth to nature. Ruskin was giving artists permission, even though landscape had been sort of historically within Western art history a lower genre within art. Ruskin's arguing that modern artists should embrace landscape as their subject matter. And also this idea that artists should leave the studio behind. They shouldn't remain isolated inside the studio. They should go outside into nature and connect with the world and look for what Ruskin was describing as truth to nature. So this is a later abridged copy. The original series were much longer, but feel free to That's not in the collection, that's just mine, so feel free to flip through it and take a look. So one of my favorite drawings that we have by Jackson is in the drawer here. You might have to later on come, or you can come up and get a little closer. This is called the Camp at Pike Lake from 1923. So at this point, the Group of Seven is formed, and Jackson goes on an excursion with the other Group of Seven member, Lauren Harris, and he sits down, and rather than positioning his stool and his sketchbook toward the landscape, which was their intent, he actually positions it and he draws their tent, so the tent that they were camping in. So this is the opposite of what they're doing, right? They've gone out to sketch the landscape, but instead he turns his focus to their camping tent. And for me, I think that demonstrates Jackson's self-awareness of himself, not just as an artist, but as a landscape artist. And I really interpret this drawing as a self-assertion of the artist as a landscape painter, because he's really sort of showing this awareness of himself in that way. And in terms of what the landscape artist at that time needed in order to leave the studio behind, we have this example of a portable sketching box. So this was A.Y. Jackson's. He gave it to the Firestones, which I think is incredible that the Firestones are not just collecting Jackson's art, but they're collecting other sort of examples of the tools that he used, which provide a great deal of insight to art historians, curators, and the public on the artist's working process. So this is his sketching box. It was something that Jackson had custom designed. On the bottom, you can see the paint would be applied and mixed, and then the top would fold out, and that was where he could put his panel to work. The artist's palette, I like to think of it as a form of technology. It's something incredibly, very simple form of technology. It's essentially a flat board. Here it's a little bit more complex because it opens up, but it's indispensable for the painter. And it acts as a kind of color laboratory, where an artist can work through ideas, mix their colors on the palette before putting them on the board or the canvas. Afterwards, if you want to take a close look, you can see how Jackson applies his color with lead white in the corner, and then it moves along with warm colors on the top and cooler colors on the side. And you can actually kind of take a look at the pigments on the palette and try to match them to some of the colors in the paintings. We have on display two examples of the outdoor sketches that Jackson would have made with that palette. You can see the size corresponds to the size of the palette. These are both done in the Ottawa region. The upper canvas, or the upper panel, is entitled Near Perth from 1961, and the lower is Water's Edge, Duhamel, Quebec from 1968. So Jackson actually moved back to Ottawa in the 1950s and the 1960s, and during that time, he sketched the Gatineau Hills and all of the surrounding areas. After he would make these sketches, which would take on average 2 hours, he would bring them back to his studio, and then he would sort through them. So some he would decide would be turned into a canvas, whereas others he would just sell. And later in life, at this point, there was a very high demand for his sketches, so it was a steady source of income for Jackson in his later career. We also have his snowshoes. So I think this is also speaking to how he's presenting himself as a landscape artist, not just a landscape artist, but a Canadian landscape artist who paints the snow. And in his autobiography, he talks about how at first he was interested in the barns or the trees or the farmhouses. But then he really becomes interested in the snow because it is like a blank canvas for the sun and the wind. The texture is constantly changing. It's more of a challenging subject for an artist who's interested in color and texture. And he likes how it changes with the seasons. So at first it's a blanket of snow, but then it turns to slush and you can see the fields underneath. And I think that this work, Fitzroy Harbour from 1969, really demonstrates Jackson's interest in capturing the fleeting effects of changing seasons, because to me it really brilliantly captures just the moment before spring almost. We're just on the cusp here. There's the last pieces of floating ice in the water. The blossoms are just coming up into the vision there on that tree with the yellow blooms. It's like you can see that he's interested in that specific time and that specific feeling that day. To transfer the work from a panel onto a canvas when he had returned from outdoor sketching and gone back into his studio, he used white thread to create a grid on the canvas. So he always considered that the finished work was a separate work from the original sketch. Yet, in using this grid, it was his way of acknowledging, I think going back to Ruskin, like the truth to nature. He's wanting some fidelity to the original sketch. And for me, that goes right back to this very 19th century idea that Ruskin is putting forward of truth to nature, and that Jackson had incorporated into his practice. So I think I'm going to switch gears now and talk about an artist who's part of the generation coming after the Group of Seven, and that is Henri Masson. And you can see here, if you want to come closer, please feel free to. This is a sketch by Henri Masson of A.Y. Jackson from 1964. Masson was born in Belgium, and he emigrated to Canada in 1921, so 1 year after the Group of Seven had formed, and he and his family settled in Ottawa. He was very much influenced by the Group of Seven, though at first he was skeptical of their approach. In 1936, he saw the exhibition that the National Gallery of Canada put forward of the Group of Seven, and he was moved by their use of color in particular. And another really key event happened early in the 1930s. So Masson was working full-time as a silver engraver, and he would only go out on weekends to sketch, and he would bring a portable sketching box like the one that Jackson had. He would go out to the fields in the area around Ottawa and do outdoor sketching. And early in his career, Jackson bought a work by Masson that was a pivotal moment for Masson, where he felt he was being encouraged by this other generation. And I think that sort of created a connection between the two artists that lasted their entire life. This was done in 1964, in fact, at a luncheon that the Firestones held at their home. So there's a really strong connection there between the Firestones, Jackson, and Masson. If we can move our stools up, and we'll take a look at some of Masson's work on the other side of the wall. So as I was saying previously, Masson sketched all around the region, and in terms of a criticism at that time, he was really celebrated as an individual in the press who captured local Ottawa scenery using a modernist approach or a modernist aesthetic. And again, that was something that he had adopted from the Group of Seven. And what I find interesting here, so we have this sketch from 1934, and then the next work we have here is Rockcliffe Park from 1937. And that's 1 year after we saw the Group of Seven show in 1936, and the influence of the Group of Seven's formal aesthetic is really apparent in this later, this sketch that was done 1 year after that important 1936 exhibition. So then around this time, Jackson buys one of his works, and then as we go into the 40s, we see him really moving into a different way of working. I think this is a really wonderful example of Masson's work, Skater's Anglesey Park, and he was really interested in depicting neighborhoods in Ottawa, like the working class, and Anglesey Park was an important place of gathering in Ottawa. It was also a place of civic protest. And we just see this sense of movement and color that Masson becomes really known for. And I'm going to conclude the spot talk today by posing a question, or sharing a question with you, which is, we have this work by Masson from 1934. So again, this is around the time that he's working full-time as a silver engraver and going out on weekends to sketch. This is inscribed on the back, Experimental Farm. And when we brought it out for display, we did a bit of research and attempted to identify the buildings that are depicted here on Experimental Farm. And we reached out to 2 experts who have knowledge of the history of the farm and are familiar with archival photographs. And they both concluded that this actually is not Experimental Farm. So we have contradictory evidence. We have on the one hand the inscription, which we believe is by the artist on the back, though might have been added at a later date. And then we have visual evidence. And we've been so far not able to actually identify the site of this, if it is indeed not Experimental Farm. But we're hoping that by putting it on display, the public might have insight. So that concludes our brief tour of outdoor painting in the Ottawa-Gatineau region.